So why did we go through all of this? Why did we go to all the trouble of bringing in Express.js? I mean, clearly Node has that HTTP library available to us. Well, Express sits on top of that library and brings two key pieces of functionality to the party. It gives us middleware and routing. Let's discuss each one of those aspects of Express. We'll find that middleware is a very powerful piece of the Express framework. Express is a very tiny core. The last time I looked, it was well under 1,500 lines of code. There's not a lot in Express's core because what it allows us to do is bring in middleware, bring in highly cohesive, loosely coupled bits of code that build a request chain coming in and a response chain going out. And each piece of middleware accepts the request and the response and calls next. And so what each piece of middleware is able to do is subtly but importantly decorate the request or decorate the response and pass it to the next person in line and the next and the next. So what does this look like in practice? Well, this is the server.js that we get if you're using the mean.js generator. When I scaffold out a new app by typing in yo mean.js, this is what my server.js file looks like. We can see we're bringing in init and configuration files. We're requiring them in. Interestingly, require, you can bring in JavaScript files or you can bring in JSON files as well. But in this case, these are both JS files, so we're bringing in init and config. We're bringing in Mongoose, as we're going to find out in the next section. Mongoose is our object library that bridges Express and MongoDB. But really what we're looking at right now, in the middle of that screen, when we bring in Express, when we require it in there and we pass in our DB connection, that is where we're spinning up Express. We can see we're listening to it. We're exporting it, but where's all the middleware? Well, let's take a deeper dive into the config directory, the Express.js file, and then you say, here's all the middleware. As I new up that app, the first thing I'll do is I'll pass it through the compress middleware. And the compress will gzip all the files we need. Once we have gzipped it, now it'll come in and do a body parser. So it'll take anything on the query string, turn that into a JSON object and attach that to the request. After it looks for the query string, it'll look for JSON in the body as well and parse that out for us. After that, it'll allow us to do method overrides. If you're a true Rastafarian, you want to use all the verbs, get and post and put and delete, but only get and post are supported in many HTML forms. So there's a way that you can override that, saying even though I'm sending this up as a post, which is semantically an insert, I really want you to treat this as a put, which is semantically an update, or a delete, which is, well, semantically a delete. But you can see how each one of these pieces of middleware works. It gets handed in the request, it makes whatever modification it needs, and then it calls next, and then calls next, and then calls next. This is why Express is so powerful and so pervasive. Not because it includes all this functionality in, but because it's extensible and it allows you to bring in the functionality you need for your application in a very clean, consistent, deterministic way. Yes, we're dealing with a bucket of bolts once again. These metaphors are coming fast and furious, aren't they? But when we're looking at these various requires, when we're finding a way to bring in our middleware and all of their transitive dependencies, we begin seeing that this is good, this is what we want. This allows us in a standard, consistent, repeatable way to bring in just the bits of functionality I want. I don't want a monolithic web server that tries to do all things to all people. I want a very tight, refined, cask strength web server that allows me to bring in just the pieces I want and ignore the rest. This notion of high cohesion and loose coupling is something I've mentioned several times here, and it's something that as good programmers we should aspire to. When we talk about something that's highly cohesive, it means it's something that does one and only one thing. I like saying you could describe a highly cohesive method or library in one sentence or less. What does the cookie parser library do? Well, it parses the cookies. What does the compression library do? Well, it adds gzip compression. What does the body parser do? Well, it parses the body. You get the idea, right? These are all wonderful examples of highly cohesive pieces of middleware. And what do we mean by loosely coupled? It means that if I am parsing cookies and parsing the body, those two modules are orthogonal to each other. They don't have any implicit or explicit reliances on each other. So they're loosely coupled in the fact that I can bring in these independent pieces of code that do one and only one thing very, very cleanly. Highly cohesive, loosely coupled code is something we should aspire to as programmers, and it's so nice when we see good examples of this out in the wild. It gives us something to emulate as we're writing our own code. So the other thing that Express brings to us is not modules, but routing. And the important piece of Express.js is as we're sending HTTP requests up to the server, it needs to route those requests to the important areas. It needs to route those requests to controllers and ultimately onto MongoDB or external web servers or just to satisfy the request on its own. But once we have all the middleware in place, we can handle routing very cleanly. We've seen an example of that already. App.get, we pass it a path and an event handler, and away we go. But once again, we're going to find that that simple example doesn't begin to tell you all the fun things you can do with that request. You can trigger a download of a resource. You can trigger JSON and JSONP responses. You can redirect to other methods. We have all kinds of interesting things we can do on the response. If we once again move from the simple hello world example to something a little bit more real world, this is a great example of a router that we'll get from the meanjs.org scaffolding. We can see if we're trying to deal with articles, we want to set up a series of RESTful endpoints that use the semantic verbs in a semantically correct way. So when I'm looking at routes to the /articles path, I can see that if someone is doing an HTTP GET, they're asking for a list of articles back. That route, in fact, hands that off to an articles list method that's included in the articles controller that we required in just a few lines previous. Now, if you have the same URI, but you're doing an HTTP post to it instead of an HTTP GET, semantically, you're trying to do an insert. And so we can see this router is going to invoke its own little bit of middleware. It's going to say, all right, are you logged in? And if you are, then we'll call next and hand you off to the articles create method. If you aren't, the requires login middleware is able to redirect you to a login page, send you the appropriate response, append the server, whatever you want it to do, but we have a well-defined way to establish all of the pieces of that request handling that we need to occur. Now, a few lines below that, we begin seeing what it looks like when you ask not just for /articles, but articles /placeholder. Anything at that point in the path is going to be stored in an articles ID variable, and we can see that when we do a get and pass in a specific URI, we're going to get that individual article back. When we do an HTTP put, we're going to make sure we're logged in, and then once we're logged in, we're going to make sure we're authorized, and once we're authorized, only then will we update the article. And of course, if we want to delete the article, we don't want to open that up to any old script kiddie out of there. We want to make sure that they have authorization and authentication in place before we actually truly delete the article. But this is Express.js in place. And in our mean stack, or our NEMA stack, with apologies, however you formulate those letters, what Express does, the key piece that it gives us is the web server. But more importantly, it gives us the RESTful endpoints that are going to be called from AngularJS. And once we get into those server methods, it's going to reach out to MongoDB and bridge the gap between those various libraries, but also those various tiers in our application. So yes, Express.js gives us two very, very important things: middleware and routing. It acts as the web server in our technology stack. And it's so important for you to recognize that Express is the web server, not Node.js. Despite all their attempts to confuse you on Node.js.org, you understand that Node.js is the platform and Express is the web server that you bring into your application to make sure that you can deploy it in a consistent and repeatable way.